I don't know who said that, but I guess we can always laugh, hopefully. Well, let me go ahead and I guess we can just start with a little bit. I would like to start right at 7 o'clock since we have a number of folks that are joining us online. So I'd like to make sure we start on time for that. And then I also, we do have kind of a hard stop. The folks here at the church need to get us out of here by 8:10. So we'll try to keep it right at 8 o'clock so we can hopefully finish up. And I guess I will start, at least by my watch, at 6:59. So I guess we'll start a minute or two early. First off, my name is John Clauson. I'm the Executive Director for Kitsap Transit, and I would like to thank you all for coming out here tonight and sharing your thoughts and your questions with us regarding our thinking about the possibility of using the Harper Dock for a moorage location. So starting with just that, I do have a short presentation. It's more of just kind of to get the juices flowing and get the discussion going and to hopefully better explain what it is that we're thinking about at this point with the use of the potential Harper Pier. To start out with, I'd share that, you know, kind of what got us here was the fact that, as many of you may know, we are now operating the high-speed passenger ferry from the Southworth Ferry Terminal to downtown Seattle. And each day, the vessels that go on that route originate in Bremerton. It's where we have the vessel tied up, and it motors from Bremerton to the Southward dock. It does its morning service. At the conclusion of its morning service, it goes back to Bremerton, and in the afternoon, sure. In the afternoon, it reverses that. So, in essence, the vessel was making this trek from Bremerton to Southworth and back 4 times a day. And what I would like to do, if we can have the presentation come on. There we go. This is just to give you an example of what the vessel does. So as I said, it parks in Bremerton and drives through Ridge Passage. It's approximately 11 miles one way for the vessel to travel. So at the end of the day, we're doing about 44 miles on that vessel. So we're interested in looking at what options we have available to try to reduce some of that travel time that the vessel was doing, and consequently all the things that go along with driving those boats, fuel, impacts to the environment. The other issue through the Rich Passage area, which is a sensitive area for wake and wake impacts. So if we're able to locate a moorage facility closer to the Southworth dock, obviously there's lots of advantages from our perspective. Now, as I said, it's approximately 11 miles from Bremerton to Southworth. It's roughly a mile from the Harper Pier to Southworth. So if we were able to come up with something that works for the Harper Pier, we just saved 40 miles a day. Now, in our looking at what options we have available, clearly we have an option of doing something right next to the Southward dock or as a part of the Southward dock. So if we were able to pull something there, that now we're talking feet of moving from the moorage facility to the car ramp of the Southward dock. So ultimately, that would be probably the best location. If all else were equal, then certainly that would be my preference, would be to go to the Southward terminal and try to do something there. Some folks have asked us, and thank you for your questions that you submitted early to us as part of the registration for tonight's meeting, we received a number of questions, not to mention the questions that we've received or comments that we've received over the last couple of months, as well as I'm sure some of you have gone on to our transit board meetings and shared your thoughts in that forum. But one of the issues is that, well, back when we first did our business plan, we were envisioning doing a passenger ferry dock at the Southward terminal. And what happened? Well, I can tell you that when we did the original business plan, we basically took the concept that Washington State Ferries was working on if they were going to enhance their WSF service by building a pier off of the Southward dock, and they were going to run their service off of that pier. So they did an analysis that determined that engineering-wise it's feasible, even to the extent that they did some analysis on, at the time, some of the environmental issues, for example, where was the eelgrass beds that we had to avoid, and that's what, if you look at that design, it kind of ran off behind the terminal building and out jogging around eel beds and went out there. Well, that was kind of our initial thought when we were putting the plan together, but we took that initial plan out to the community and focus groups and asked the community for their input. And some of the things we heard from the group that was here in the South Kitsap area was that the time it would take for us to put that pier in before we could start service was basically unacceptable. What we were talking about is that we would ask you to approve the tax, and 10 years later we would be back with service. And I distinctly remember the superintendent of the South Kitsap School District, who was on the group, basically said, ain't gonna happen. So as a result of the discussions that we had with the communities, we stepped back, and in one of those aha moments, we thought, why don't we do what WSF was ultimately heading for, which was to build the vessels large enough to pull into the car slip. And that way they wouldn't have to do the extra dock out there. And with the last vessels that they owned, the Chinook and the Snohomish, the big ones, they were designing those with the expectation that they could go into a car slip. So our aha moment was, why can't we do the same thing? The original plan called for 150 passenger boats to serve the Southworth route. When we designed them to fit into the car slip, it became quite a bit larger. They're now about a 250 passenger vessel, but as a result of that, we were able to start service much, much faster. So that's why we kind of went away from what WSF was intending with the passenger pier at Southworth Ferry Terminal. And as a result, we parked the boat in Bremerton. So here we are today. Now there's other comments that we received, and I'm going to try to there were a lot of comments, and try to summarize them if I can in just a few things. One is the issue of access to the Harper Pier if we were to do this. Our intentions would be that your access to that pier would remain. We're not at all planning to come down there and put a fence across the end and say you can't come onto it. What we're looking to do is to see if there's a way that we can put a mooring float on the end so that access to the pier would remain. And I would probably point you to Kingston as an example. The service that we operate out of Kingston, the passenger ferry portion of it is attached to a public fishing pier. And the community still has the same access to that fishing pier that they had prior to us running our ferry service. Now, there are security issues that come with ferries, especially the larger vessels, and what we would probably have to do is whatever float we would put out there, we would have to restrict access to that float, but that would not restrict access to the pier, and hopefully we're going to try to see if we can put something together that would maintain as much of the activities that the community is currently enjoying that pier for. So that's kind of generally what we're hoping to be able to do. The other comment that I would make, based on some of the comments that we've heard from folks, is that parking. We're going to take over the community with a parking lot, and that is not our intention. We are not planning to run service out of there. It's simply going to be parking the boats there when they're not in service at Southworth. And we've actually taken it to the point where we run a bus company. We can have our crews park here, for example, at the Harper Park and Ride, and we can shuttle them down to the dock and drop them off so that they wouldn't even have any of their cars down there. Now, would we park a vehicle? Yeah, we would probably stop down there when we have to offload supplies for the boats, toilet paper, paper towels, that sort of thing, but it would only be a temporary stop, unload, and then we would be out of there. So that's kind of our intention. Now, again, to kind of get the juices flowing and people thinking, I wanted to give you an example of one thing that we were talking about. And one of the other comments that we received was, well, we let a contract with a consultant to come in and figure out, you know, how do we do this? And I guess we're further down the road than I want to share that we are. We did hire the consultant that we've had on retainer, basically. They've done a lot of work for us in the passenger ferry business. And essentially what I asked them to do was to look at a high level, is this even possible? Is the water deep enough? Can the pier handle whatever it is that we would need to do? You know, those kinds of basic things, as well as give me a couple artist renditions of what it would look like so that we could start this dialogue with the community and start identifying what are the concerns and what are the issues. And certainly we know a lot of them, environmental issues. The estuary has been brought up. I can guarantee you that before we could even consider moving forward with something like this, we would have to go through an extensive environmental review process. But we're not there yet. This is step one of looking at this possibility and other possibilities of other opportunities or options that we have. So to start, this is kind of the artist's rendition. And we asked for a couple, three different views, what it would look like when you are down there and or driving by the pier. So this would be from, obviously, in front of the coffee shop. This one would be as you're approaching the pier from, say, here, for example. And then going out on the pier, this is what one version would look like. And what we were talking about is off of the end of the pier, off to the right, that we would install basically a 10-foot by 10-foot piece on the side of the pier, similar to the little jut out that takes you down to the little float that's there now. And then from that point, we would put a gangway out to the float that would be anchored out by those pilings that are out there in the water. So this is just one concept. We looked at some other possibilities of, well, what happens if we come off of the pier on the right side? What happens if we come off the pier on the left side? We discounted those pretty quickly because the first thing, if we came off on the right side, or what I would refer to as the south side, we would be impacting any access to that little float that is currently being used by folks that kayak and do whatever. Off to the left, the water just wasn't deep enough for us to be able to do something there. And the reason that we put the little jut out there on the south corner was to preserve as much of that end of the pier, if you will, for the folks that like to go out and go fishing and squidding and all the things that are currently going on out at the pier. So with that, I'm gonna stop with getting the juices flowing here. And really what we're hoping to do is to hear your questions, your comments, and we're going to try to answer as many of them tonight as we can. I'm not going to have all of the answers, unfortunately, but for those that I can answer, we'll either get the answers for you. We're going to be posting on our website at kitsaptransit.org that kind of a frequently asked question. So we'll have all of the questions that we have here tonight, as well as others that we're not going to be able to get to now. Because of COVID, we're not going to be able to pass around a mic. That's why we did the submit your comments on a piece of paper and send them down. And Sanjay Bhatt is our public information person here, who he is going to be kind of passing those questions. He has a microphone so that the folks that are watching online will be able to hear the questions as well. And then we also have folks up above that will be sending any questions or comments that we get from folks online down. So Sanjay will be able to share those. So I know we've got a couple comments or questions that came in early. So Sanjay, maybe you could start off with some of those.
Sure. So a ton of the comments fall into categories, and so because we don't have a lot of time together tonight, I'm going to kind of group them. And so many of the questions that came in, John, both from online through the RSVP form and people who have filled out cards, they would like to know, why not build another pier at the Southworth terminal where the ferry is already located? What discussions have been had with the state regarding Southworth? And what other options have been explored? And what is the budgeted amount for exploring other places?
Well, let's see if I can remember all of them. First off, the issue of the Southworth Pier and what options are we looking at. I shared the initial look at it, but that's a rather long process to get that dock in. And really what we're looking for is a place just to park the boats, not operate service on and off the boats. We have that figured out now with pulling into the car slip. Conversations that we've had with WSF, I've had a conversation with their chief of staff about, are you guys even open to considering us looking at attaching something onto the side of the pier? There's a lot of stuff that is going on with the Southward dock in the future. They're looking at putting in they're moving the terminal building off of the water and up onto the shore. They're looking at, we're working with them, and we recently got some federal funding to help with the development of a second car slip for the Southward dock. So there's an awful lot of stuff that is planned for the dock, and I wanted to make sure that in and amongst all of that, would they consider us looking at somehow hanging something similar off of the Southward dock? And the response I got back at this level, which is fine, go for it. So we're going to be looking at what options we have for the Southward dock, and as I mentioned, from my perspective, that would be the ideal location. But we'll have to wait and see, because there's so many issues that have to be looked at before we could ever consider any location. Did I miss anything?
So I think that
oh, and the budget.
The budget for exploring multiple potential locations.
Well, the budget right now, I think we've got roughly $5 million that has been allocated in our capital budget for us to look at these options. Now, I will tell you that in hindsight, I wish I would have put it as the Harper dock. I should have put it more generic into alternate moorage locations. But to be honest with you, I wasn't trying to hide anything. I thought Harper Pier is one that we want to look at. I've had conversations with the Port of Bremerton, who owns the pier. So that's how it was presented, and my board approved it. Now, I'm going to be asking the board to change the verbiage that identifies that line item so it could be used for things like Southworth. Can we use some of those dollars to research the possibility at Southworth?
So I just want to say to everyone, my compliments to the crowd online and in person. We've got like well over 100 questions here, and I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but we are going to keep these questions, and any that we don't get to, we will still be putting together a FAQ sheet. Since these boats, John, need frequent maintenance and inspection by the Coast Guard, how will that be accomplished in this area, or will they be taken elsewhere to have this done? Where would that happen? And a couple of the other questions related to this that have come in, there are concerns about environmental impact if there's a leak on the boat, what have you.
Well, I can share that there's environmental impact concerns for everything that we do. But on the maintenance questions, yes, the vehicles have to be inspected by the Coast Guard. They have to be taken out of the water for Coast Guard inspections. Periodically, the Coast Guard will come on board to verify and check crew proficiencies, equipment, fire extinguishers, life jackets, those sort of things. But for the most part, heavy maintenance is done elsewhere, lifting the boats out of the water. We can't do that. We currently don't have any facilities that allow us to do that. And depending upon the size of the vessel, some of them we can take up to, like the Port Townsend, they have what's called a travel lift, where there's 2 finger piers and this machine comes out with straps, and you drive the boat on the straps, and then they lift it up out of the water and set it up on the beach. The bigger vessels we actually have to take to a dry dock. And right now, their dry docks are over in Seattle, in that general vicinity. There's more up and down the Puget Sound, but that's generally where we go. And any kind of heavy maintenance, we need to change a motor or fix a generator, stuff like that. Most of that is done remotely. We do have one dock in Bremerton where we can do some heavier maintenance, but for example, we don't have any kind of equipment that can lift out some of the bigger, heavier stuff, so we have to take it elsewhere to have that done.
So related to that, John, is several people have asked, what when we say light maintenance would be done at a pier, whether it's Harper or Southward, what do we mean by light maintenance? What are we talking about?
Light maintenance is essentially emptying the garbage cans, vacuuming the inside of the vessel, that type of stuff. Really not much more than just that kind of daily stuff that occurs. Again, if the engines need to have the oil changed, more than likely we'll take that to Bremerton, where we have the parts and the pieces and the oil reserves and things of that nature to be able to do those types of work. But mostly cleaning the windows, vacuuming the boats, cleaning the restrooms. That's what we refer to as light maintenance.
There's a couple of related questions around operations, if we were to operate there, that are kind of related. Will moorage at Harper require lights all night? Will the boats remain tied up at Harper Pier over the weekend?
Yes and yes. They will require some level of lights just because, again, because of the size of the vessels. There's Coast Guard requirements for security. Part of what we would certainly do as if we were to move forward with this is look at what are the options that are available, so we're not shining lights up into your living room windows, and that we can keep the lights contained, if you will, at the vessels, in the vessel site.
A question about if other areas are being looked at, why is there only the artist's rendition showing Harper?
Well, because we're starting with a community discussion, and I wanted to be able to show the community what it is that we're talking about and what kind of impacts we would have. Now, honestly, we are further ahead in the pier at the Harper dock than we are at Southworth. As I said, I just had a conversation with the folks at Southworth, the WSF, about us moving forward. Now, I've talked with our same consultant that did this, or the artist renditions, about, give me a scope. What are we talking about? What are the next steps for us to start doing a little bit more in depth at the Southworth Pier versus the Harper Pier?
So a number of questions deal with the community's recreational use, John. How have you looked at how the dive park and its 2 sunken barges and cable would be affected? Will we be still able to crab fish off the pier and scuba dive and boat near it?
You know, I can't give you 100%, but certainly that's my expectation, is that you would continue to do that. We are aware of the scuba diving area out there. Somebody shared with us kind of a map from the scuba diving community as to where the sunken vessels are. They're more off to the north of the pier, if you will. And we know that the circuit that they would normally follow. Now, part of that circuit would be probably right where we'd have the pier. And we would have to make sure that, you know, folks aren't diving underneath the pier when the boats are coming and going, so we'd have to set up some kind of a communication system. But certainly the goal would be to try to preserve the access that's there now for crabbing, fishing, diving, swimming, kayaking, all of that. Thank you.
There are a number of concerns about the Harper estuary. What would be done to protect the recovering habitat, and what would be our assessment of how we would measure our impact?
Well, at this point, the first step would be to try to figure out what is the impact. We certainly are aware of the estuary, but we haven't gone far enough down this path with the Harper Pier to be able to tell you, well, this is what the scientists are telling us would be the potential impact of our operation. So I guess that's a question that we'll have to wait if we continue down this path until we get to that level. Certainly with the environmental issues that are required to be dealt with for pretty much anything that you do in the Puget Sound, it's not something that we can just ignore and skim over. We're going to have to deal with it. We're going to have to identify it. And that might be the fatal flaw. I don't know. You know, at this point, we're so early in the process that we haven't gotten that far to identify, you know, what are those impacts. But we're going to have to do it if we continue down this path.
Okay, so sort of a follow-on to that. Obviously, it's there's some environmental concerns. There's a question about where would the Southworth ferry refuel, and can't they just stay at the refueling dock?
Currently, those vessels get fueled in Seattle, and it's a commercial fueling facility. We have to work an appointment into the daily schedule for those boats, and we currently, I'm not aware, we've got Ray Scott here as our Marine Services Director. I don't think they have any facilities that we could just park. So for the bigger boats, like I said, we fuel them in Seattle. The smaller boats, we actually have a fueling facility at the docks in Bremerton, but that's too slow to fill up the volume of fuel for the bigger boats, so we go to the Seattle commercial facility.
Incidentally, we're getting questions from our online audience too, so I'm kind of wanting to make sure I get to some of those as well. So that was about refueling. John, here's another question from the online audience. How do you keep this area safe for scuba divers that use this pier all the time with large vessels that would be coming in and out of the area?
Well, again, I think I addressed that. We'll have to figure out what is a good system. And keep in mind that the vessels coming in and out of this area would be similar to what we're doing in Bremerton right now, which would be 4 times a day. The boat leaves. What time do we start that route in the morning, Ray?
We start, I think, 5:20 is the first run, so we leave about 4 to 5 or so.
So between 5 and 8, 9 o'clock when we shut down for the morning, then the boat would be parked there until the afternoon, where we would fire it up to go back to do the afternoon service at Southworth. So there won't be a tremendous amount of boat moving. There will be 4 times a day, but it's at hours where I hope they're not out scuba diving, but you never know. I don't know enough about that.
Another question was related to the, do we know what is the cost differential between having a tie-up in Harper versus Southworth?
No. As I pointed out with that graphic, it's about a mile of travel between Harper to Southworth. As I mentioned, if we were able to put a pier at Southworth, we're talking feet. So from an economic standpoint, it would make way more sense for us to have the boat tied up next to the Southworth dock than it would be to Harper, just by that 1 mile alone. But moving the boats out of Bremerton to somewhere in this area, now you're talking, like I said, 40 miles a day of fuel savings, 4 trips a day through Rich Passage, which is kind of an environmentally sensitive area.
Another kind of environmental impact question. If, based on what you showed this evening, John, would any dredging be required?
No. That was part of the initial quick look, is the water deep enough to handle, the boats, and they looked at what the, extreme low tides would be, and would there be enough water for the boats to park there, and it looks like it would be fine, so no. We don't anticipate doing any dredging to be able to park the boats there.
Okay, another question that came in is the usage of Harper Pier temporary until a new passenger-only facility can be built adjacent to the Wsf dock in Southworth?
Well, I would rather just build a facility once, and if it looked like it would be similar to build one at Southworth versus Harper, I would just wait till we build one at Southworth instead of spending the money to put in something at a Harper and then turn around and doing the same thing in Southworth. The other piece of it is that the float that we would be tying up to, we currently have a float, so wherever we park that float, I'd rather keep it there because we don't have the ability to keep one float at Harper and build a new float for Southworth, and then what do we do with the pier at Harper? Not to mention the environmental issues of to wherever we would need to anchor that float, we're going to have to put in some piling, and that's not cheap. So if it makes more sense to go to Southworth, I'd rather just go to Southworth first and do the investment there.
So a couple of the questions that have come in from online and in person here have also asked about other locations, John. So you've talked about Southworth. There's also some question about what about, have we looked at Manchester, Moorage? Have we looked at Vashon? Have we looked at other locations besides Harper Pier?
To the extent that we've looked at the Harper Pier, no, not really, because again, we're pretty early into the look at Harper Pier. I mentioned about Southworth and where we are at that process. I think we need to look at other potential options. I had one person send me a suggestion that we look at the possibility of putting a pier or some type of a moorage facility as part of the environmental science place down next to the Manchester Park, kind of right at where you come out of Rich Passage, kind of in there. It's worth taking a look at, see if that's an option. Wouldn't be as good as Southworth, but it's an option. Manchester, we'd have to talk with the Port of Manchester about how we could put in something that would not restrict the community's access to the waterfront near boat launch. That could accommodate, us mooring boats there. So, but it's something that we need to take a look at.
John, a couple more environmental questions. This may be related to how we maintain and moor the boats there. Would there be any sewage pump out or any kind of fluids that would be coming off the vessel into the water?
No. No, we have pump out facilities that we use. I believe there's pump out at the fueling in Seattle. No? So what if we take it to Bremerton and pump it out there?
We pump it at Bremerton.
Yeah. We have the ability at their docks in Bremerton to be able to pump out the holding tanks and fill the water. So no, we wouldn't envision any of those types of activities going on at this facility.
Let's see, I'm trying to keep up. You all are doing a great job asking a lot of great questions. So, another question from the online audience. Could you address what impacts this would have on the aesthetics of the area, such as fences, signs, parking, lights, and any additional traffic? I think you spoke to that a little bit, but I think if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, I think, at this point, what we've showed you was what we envision the visual impact to be. We certainly asked the consultant to do it to scale so that it would be a reasonably good example of what you would be looking at from the shoreline. Fencing and that sort of thing, I don't really see, other than, as I said, we're going to have to restrict access down on the float where the boats are parked for security reasons. That may be at the top of the gangway, it may be at the bottom of the gangway. We'd have some kind of a gate there, but beyond that, that's the only fencing. Lighting, as I already talked about, there you go. Lighting would be more just for the security of the boat, so it would be out there. Now, having said that, I have heard from some folks in the community that some of the challenges that recreational use is dealing with currently is the electrical service that goes out onto that pier. And what I've been told is people that do squidding will plug in their lights, and I don't know if it's often, but occasionally the breakers pop. Well, if we're going to be out there, and we're going to have to make some improvements, we're going to have to bring power out to the boats and that sort of thing. Why don't we just fix that problem so that the community would get a benefit through at least that part of it?
John, a couple of questions about the renderings. I guess the question, the root of the question is they're questioning that the boats aren't the right size in the renderings. The back up boat is much bigger. What are the actual dimensions of the boats?
Can you bring those boat renderings? Ray, what's the dimensions of the boats?
They are 125 feet long and 38 feet wide.
125 feet long and 38 feet wide is the dimensions of these boats. So again, when we talked to the consultants, I asked them to try to put this into perspective so that, it would be unfair for us to bring a rendering that showed a dinghy out there in the dock and say, gee, you won't even see it. What we're trying to do with these renderings is to make them very close to what you would actually see from a couple different angles.
Okay, let's see here. Please explain the business structure of Kitsap Transit. Is any part of it private for profit?
No, we're not private for profit. We are a local government. Technically, we're known as a Public Transit Benefit Area Authority. There's special RCWs that allow the creation of PTBAs, as we refer to them. So we are strictly public. We are supported almost completely, as far as the operation is concerned, from local option sales tax that the voters of Kitsap County approved. We are governed by a board of elected officials based on their positions that they are elected to. For example, the 3 county commissioners, all the mayors of all 4 cities, and 2 additional council members sit on our board. And the last is we also have a non-voting member that represents the unions that we work with. We have 3 unions that we work with in our operation.
Okay, thank you, John. I think there's, I guess, another technical question here about measurements. The question is, the dock is 400 feet long. The ferries would add 200 feet to the dock. Is that correct?
What's the length of the pier? The float? The float's 110 feet. Okay, the float is 110 feet long. And the boats would possibly extend a little bit out one end or the other, but generally the boats are pretty close to the same length as the float. So the float is, if you ever rode the passenger ferry programs that were in operation when the Coleman Dock construction started over at Wsf and they moved the passenger dock from the south side of Coleman to the north side, where those boats came to and docked and tied up to, that's the float. Literally, that's the float that we're talking about. So it's about the length of the boat, maybe a little bit shorter. So there would be a little bit of an overhang of the boats, one side or another. What'd you say, they're 125? So you're talking 15 feet extending beyond the float.
So someone's asked about another location, whether we've considered Blake Island.
No. We've not considered Blake Island. And earlier there was a question about Vashon Island, and no, we've not considered Vashon Island. One of the reasons, and I certainly don't want to speak for WSF, but one of the reasons that they're interested in putting in a second car slip at the Southward terminal is not only for redundancy, but also for the ability that they might be able to tie up a vessel there at Southworth. Right now, the vessels that they use for that route are all tied up on Vashon Island, and they have some issues with shuttling crews. Not all of the ferry crews live on Vashon Island, so they have to shuttle crews from our side, and I'm sure there's some from West Seattle side to get out to the boat so that they can start up and go. So I guess for somewhat the same reason is that we've not considered Vashon as a viable option.
So there's sort of 2 questions that seem to be similar. So I'm going to group them together, John. Where exactly is the push for moving it away from the Southworth Ferry Terminal coming from? Why not suspend looking at Harper until you do a comparable study and concepts for Southworth and Manchester?
Well, I think it just makes sense that we should be exploring all of our options that are available at the same time, as opposed to working through one, and then if we find a fatal flaw with that one, now all of a sudden we have to start back over, and we've just delayed the eventual solution. So if we were to do them simultaneously, then we can hopefully come down to the end and say, here's the pros and cons of each of those that we looked at. Which one makes the most sense? What are the biggest challenges for either or is there something that stopped our review early because here's a fatal flaw. There's no way we can overcome this issue.
Let's see here. If there was a Harper Pier, how frequently would the boats need to go to Bremerton to do their service and dump, pumping and whatnot?
Ray, can you answer that question?
They mainly have to go there for their oil changes, which is about every 250 hours with the generators. So you got two. So you're looking at roughly every couple of weeks that you go in Bremerton.
I don't know if the people online could hear that, but essentially we'd have to take them to Bremerton to do things like oil changes, and that is required to happen around 250 hours on the engines. So we're thinking that it's probably going to be, once every 2 weeks?
Yep.
About once every 2 weeks, we'd need to bring the boat into Bremerton to do the oil changes and that sort of thing.
Another question that came, I think he talked about the sewage.
All the pump out,
We typically pump it daily, but if we're not pumping it there, we can find other places to pump it.
okay, I don't know if you heard that, but Ray was saying that typically we pump it daily. Is that when we would have to, or is that just because it's convenient?
Because it's convenient.
So how long do you think it could go before between?
4 days easy.
Okay, so 3-4 days is where we would have to go to get it pumped out. And, we could look at what options are available, whether it's taking it to Bremerton or somewhere else.
So, a question from the online audience. Who really has the final say? Does the community really have any vote on this?
I guess ultimately it would be up to the Transit Board of Directors to make the final call. But, we take our role as a public agency pretty seriously. And if there is just an absolute no way in the world for Harper Pier, then, we certainly aren't looking to get into a battle with the community. So hopefully we can get this issue resolved before it gets down to who is the final say on whether we move forward or not. There's a whole lot of steps that have to go between here and that decision. There's a lot of things that are outside of collectively our control. There's environmental issues, there are tribal issues, there's just a number of things that we would have to check off the list before this is even something to be considered.
Okay, so some more questions coming in online and from the audience here. And okay, so this deals with hypothetical, if there was a mortgage facility at Harper Pier, would bathrooms or porta-potties be permanently installed?
Well, my understanding there's already a porta-potty there that I'm assuming is paid for by the Port of Bremerton. And if we were to move forward with this, we would assume that responsibility. We're not envisioning putting restrooms in out on the pier. Again, we don't see that, certainly we wouldn't need them for the operation. Now, I have heard some comments about the porta-potty that's out there currently and whether or not it's easily accessible. Maybe that's something that we could look at if that's of interest to the community, is seeing what we could do to improve that facility. But we're not envisioning putting in public restrooms out there.
So there have been also a couple of questions around, would Kitsap Transit be receptive to adding mitigations to benefit the community, maybe creating a public beach in the area?
We're certainly open to those kinds of discussions. I wouldn't rule them out by any means. Again, we're really wanting to be a good neighbor, not here, we're from the federal government, we're here to help you kind of an attitude. So if there are things that would make it work, certainly open to them.
Okay, there's a question again about measurements. You still have to have a plank or gangway to get to the float. Please be more specific on how big that would be.
Well, again, that rendition kind of showed you, we're envisioning that gangway probably being somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100 feet in length. We would want to rest that far enough into the float so that when the tide goes out and the float goes down, that thing is going to roll closer to the shoreline. So we would have adequate length of that gangway to get on that float, and I'm guessing, 5 feet wide. That's typically what you see in these kind of standard gangways that are put up.
Was state grant funding used to develop the Harper dock? If so, does the agency allow possible use of the dock that is not recreational?
I can't answer the question of what funding was used to put into Pier.
Okay.
So I don't think I could really answer that. It certainly wouldn't be our intent to open the pier up to commercial operations. What we're interested in is the end of the pier to hang a gangway off of it and out to the float where we'd park our boats.
John, another question related to Southworth. What is the next step with working with WSF to dock at Southworth? And can another community meeting be held to provide an update?
Absolutely, on the other community meeting, I welcome an opportunity to come out and share what's going on. The next steps, as I mentioned when I talked with the consultant, I asked them to give me kind of a scope of what would be the next steps. And from my perspective, probably the first thing to do would be to sit down with WSF staff and try to identify what is their long-range vision for the dock, and then see how can we incorporate a float into that vision. As I said, from what I know, and I don't know the timing of it, but WSF is looking to move the terminal building up onto shore. They're also looking at possibly reducing the width of the pier from 4 lanes down to 2 lanes. They'd like to be able to keep all of the car holding area up on the land and not out over the water. We're talking, early on about that second car slip. So it's trying to figure out, with all of what they see as their future for the dock, is there a place that we can tie into it to put in basically that same 10-foot square place to rest the gangway and out to some floats that would be anchored out there.
Some questions about dollars, John. What would this proposal save as a percentage of the transit operating budget?
That I don't know. We haven't gotten that far into it. I shared with you the mileage that would be saved on a daily basis. We have not gone through that kind of a calculation to see what that equates in fuel savings, labors, those issues. I would guess and say that probably as a percentage, it would be relatively small compared to the overall, but we haven't gone through that.
So a question from the online audience. What is the rough timeline of having studies done and making a decision? A year, a half year, longer? And would those studies be public?
Well, certainly the studies would be public. I think it's awfully optimistic to think that we could get something in a year. Really, these kinds of processes take an awful lot of time to do all of the environmental assessments, and further engineering and all of the things that you would have to look at. So my guess, I mean, I'd be happy if we could see something in 2 years. But I think that might even be a bit optimistic, and I would be happy to come back as often as you would like to kind of give you an update. I wouldn't come back just to say, I don't have anything to share, but when we do reach, shall we say, a milestone of some type, absolutely, I'd be happy to come back. And Sanjay, I'm kind of keeping an eye on the clock here. We've got a little less than 10 minutes, so.
Yeah. One of the questions was about the renderings as far as what vessels are actually rendered there in the rendering.
The ones that we modeled it after is the Manatee, which is the vessel that we're currently using on the Southward service. Now, we put 2 of them in there of the same. We only have 2 in the fleet, and one of them is going to be up in Kingston, but we're also going to be refurbishing a vessel that we just acquired from the Bay Area to be able to put, you know, make it a bow loader and park it there. But the renderings were done with 2 of the vessels that we use currently for the Southworth. I'm sorry. No, the Solano is not that one. Those are two of, like I said, the Ennetai. So the Solano is the one that we purchased from the Bay Area, and that's the one that's going to go in and get refurbished. We have to make modifications to it so that it can pull into a car slip. Currently, it cannot. It's not designed for it. So the Solano could be one of the vessels there. I know Ray and I are having this debate almost on a weekly basis. He would rather keep the Solano up in Kingston. I just want ready access to it, so if something happens to the Ennetai, that we can get a replacement boat in operation pretty quickly.
Right. If you have more questions, you know, please hand them to Jill or
Joe, I don't know if this gentleman has one or not.
go ahead.
Oh, we've got one over here too, so.
So for the, So for the online audience, there was a comment about the desire to keep the pier for the benefit of recreational use, and concern that once and if Kitsap Transit were to build a moorage facility there, that it would just be a matter of time before it becomes operational and business taking over the pier. Is that essentially the concern, sir? Yes. So the online audience can hear that. We've got a couple minutes left. One of the questions that really has come through loud and clear through several of the comments that we've received through the RSVP form, is that the community really, I won't say the community, but there's a large segment of the community that has very little trust in what Kitsap Transit is doing. John, do you want to speak to establishing trust or our obligations to the community?
Okay, well, I don't think that my words are going to change people's positions on that. And, excuse me, let's keep this down to questions, please. I don't think that whatever I can say, number one, I can't guarantee it for now until eternity. Things change. I'm only going to be in this position for a while, and somebody is going to take over from my position. People that are on my board today may not be there in 10 years. So I can't stand here and guarantee you that for now until eternity, it's not going to change. What I would hope is that when and if it ever moved from what we're talking about here, that there would be this kind of dialogue that would occur, and whoever would be in the decision-making role would certainly take everything into consideration. But like I said, I can't stand here and guarantee you absolutely for the next 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years that it's going to be what I'm telling you. I can tell you that as long as I'm here and what I'm sharing with the board, this is all we're talking about doing. So yeah.
One last question for the evening. This is from the online audience. There are a number of homes in that area. I live right on the water, very close to Harper Pier. The banks all along the surrounding pier area are in very fragile condition. How would that be mitigated? And a related question is, what is the plan to mitigate bulkhead erosion should it occur?
Well, I would only say that that's something that we're going to have to determine to see if there will be such erosion. We're very sensitive to bulkhead erosion and beach impacts. That's one of the reasons that we're here tonight, is to try to lessen that issue in the Rich Passage area, which is very sensitive to it, and we're responding to those issues. We have spent millions of dollars, literally, in studying wake impacts and impacts to the beaches and the bulkheads and things of that nature. In fact, one of the reasons that the vessel that we have that we run from Bremerton is the size it is because of wake impacts. So we would be very sensitive to that, but we'd have to figure out, obviously our goal would be to not have any wake impact, but we'd have to look at it.
We're at time.
And with that, Sanjay, it's 8:01. I would like to certainly thank you all once again for coming out tonight. I want to thank the church for the use of their facilities and their equipment. Thank you very much. We always depend on the church for these types of things, and they always kind of come through for us. And I would also like to recognize Senator Randall over there in the corner. And thank you, Senator, for coming out tonight and listening to your constituents and what we're talking about doing. So with that, we're a couple minutes after 8, so I'm going to once again thank you all and I guess officially adjourn the meeting.